Hospitals at night have a way of unsettling even the most rational minds. The hum of machinery, the faint smell of antiseptic, and the oppressive quiet can make the smallest sound feel like an alarm. At Mercy General Hospital, though the unease had a name, Room 214, everyone knew the stories. A room where lights flickered without reason, monitors malfunctioned, and patients claimed they weren't alone. I always chalked it up to the power of suggestion. If you expect something to feel eerie, it probably will. That was my mindset until the night I worked in Room 214. It began like any other Tuesday night. I was catching up on patient charts at the nurse's station when Lisa, one of my colleagues, walked over. "Hey, we've got someone going into 214 tonight," she said, placing a clipboard on the counter. I glanced up, frowning. 214? I thought they stopped using that room. Lisa shrugged. "We're at capacity, so it's either that or the hallway. It's just a room, right?" "Right," I replied, though a prickling sensation crept up my neck. "Who's the patient?" "Mrs. Harper. Post-op recovery, hip surgery. She's stable but needs monitoring overnight." Nodding, I took the clipboard and headed to prepare the room. The air grew noticeably cooler as I approached 214. The hallway lights flickered faintly, but I shook it off. Faulty wiring wasn't uncommon in older parts of the hospital. When I opened the door, the room seemed normal. Quiet, clean, just another hospital room. I adjusted the bed, checked the monitor, and set up the IV. By the time Mrs. Harper was wheeled in, I had convinced myself that all the rumors about 214 were just that. Rumors. Mrs. Harper was a sweet woman, probably in her late 70s, with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's so quiet here," she remarked as I helped her settle in. "Too quiet." "Quiet is good," I replied, smiling as I checked her vitals. "It means you'll have a peaceful night." Her expression didn't change. "Does anyone else stay on this floor at night?" "Not tonight," I said, avoiding her gaze. "But if you need anything, just press the call button. I'll be close." She nodded, her eyes drifting toward the far corner of the room. "I think I'll need you sooner than you think," she murmured. I paused halfway to the door. "Why's that?" She hesitated. "I feel like someone's watching." I turned to look at the corner she was staring at. It was empty. "It's probably just the pain meds," I said lightly. "Get some rest, Mrs. Harper. You'll feel better in the morning." Her only response was a faint, uncertain nod. I returned to the nurse's station, but I couldn't focus. Every time I tried to review a chart, my mind drifted back to room 214. Why had Mrs. Harper seemed so unsettled? Why was I suddenly so on edge? It didn't help when, around midnight, the call button for 214 lit up. When I entered the room, Mrs. Harper was sitting upright, clutching her blanket. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What's wrong?" I asked. Hurrying to her side, she pointed to the same corner she had been staring at earlier. "He was there," she whispered. I felt a chill. "Who was there?" "A man," she said, her voice trembling. "He just stood there watching me. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was looking at me." I forced a calm smile, though my heart was pounding. "There's no one here, Mrs. Harper. You're safe." "No," she insisted. "He's real, and he doesn't want me here." I checked the corner again. It was empty, of course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were darker than they should have been. "Let me check the cameras," I said. "I'll make sure no one's sneaking around." Mrs. Harper grabbed my wrist as I turned to leave. "Don't leave me alone." Her grip was surprisingly strong. "I'll only be gone for a minute," I said gently. "I promise." The hallway cameras showed nothing. No one had entered or exited room 214 except me. Still, the unease in my chest didn't go away. When I returned to the room, Mrs. Harper was staring at the corner again. "Did you see him?" she asked urgently. "No," I said, keeping my voice steady. "The cameras didn't show anything either." She didn't look at me. "He only comes when I'm alone." I hesitated, then pulled a chair next to her bed. "I'll stay for a while." "Okay." Mrs. Harper relaxed slightly, her grip on the blanket loosening. For the next hour, the room was silent, except for the steady beeping of the monitor. I was starting to think she'd imagined the whole thing when the lights flickered. Mrs. Harper gasped, grabbing my arm. "Do you see it?" I turned toward the corner, my flashlight in hand. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move. But when I blinked, it was gone. "It's just the light," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was reassuring her or myself. She shook her head. He's still here. He's always here. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I must have dozed off in the chair, but now I was on my feet, heart racing. The fourth stand had toppled over, and Mrs. Harper was sitting bolt upright, her eyes fixed on the corner. "He's closer now," she whispered. "Mrs. Harper, there's nothing—" "Don't lie to me," she snapped. "You see him, don't you?" I didn't want to admit it, but I did. A faint outline of a figure stood in the corner, barely visible in the dim light. As I stared, the figure seemed to shift, its edges blurring like smoke. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice trembling. A deep, guttural whisper filled the room. "You left me." Mrs. Harper clutched her chest, her breathing shallow. "Make him go away," she pleaded. "Please." I stepped forward, my flashlight aimed at the figure. "Leave her alone," I shouted. The whisper grew louder, overlapping with itself. "You left me. You left me. You left me." The lights flickered violently and the room grew colder. My breath fogged in the air as the figure began to move toward us. Suddenly, Mrs. Harper screamed. The monitors flatlined and she collapsed back onto the bed. I rushed to her side, trying to resuscitate her, but the whispering didn't stop. It felt like it was everywhere. Inside my head, in the walls, in the air. When I finally looked back at the corner, the figure was gone. The next morning, Mrs. Harper was pronounced dead. The official cause was listed as a heart attack, but I knew better. I checked the hospital records and found that years ago, a man named Henry Ward had died in room 214 after being left unattended for hours during a staff shortage. Since then, every patient assigned to the room had reported the same thing. A figure in the corner, whispering. I requested that room 214 be permanently closed, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I never look toward the corner. The story fades to black with the faint sound of a heart monitor flatlining in a whisper, "You left me." Mercy Memorial Hospital wasn't just where I worked. It was practically my second home. I'd been a janitor there for over 10 years. Night shifts were usually uneventful, cleaning empty hallways, dumping trash, and making sure everything looked spotless for the day staff. But there was one unspoken rule everyone followed. Stay away from the 5th floor. The pediatric wing on the 5th floor had been shut down for years after a fire. The stories about it ranged from tragic to downright terrifying, but I never paid them much attention. After all, they were just stories. At least that's what I thought. It was a stormy Thursday night, and the rain hammered against the hospital's tall windows. Lightning illuminated the hallways every now and then, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. I had just finished mopping the 1st floor corridor when the elevator dinged behind me. I turned to see the doors slide open. The car was empty. "Great, another glitch," I muttered under my breath. The elevator at Mercy was notorious for acting up. I pushed my cleaning cart toward the doors, but something made me stop. The button for the 5th floor was lit. The first sign I frowned. The button for the 5th floor hadn't worked in years. It was taped over. The floor declared unsafe after the fire. Maintenance staff had assured everyone it was disconnected entirely. "Must be a malfunction," I mumbled, stepping into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft thud, and the car jolted slightly as it began to ascend. 2, 3 dots, 4 dots. I watched the numbers light up on the panel, my stomach tightening as it passed the 4th floor, and stopped at 5. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open to reveal darkness. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped to the edge of the elevator, peering out into the shadowy hallway. The only light came from a single flickering bulb far down the corridor. The air felt colder, heavier. Then I heard it. Faint laughter, high-pitched and childlike, echoed down the hall. "Hello," I called, my voice shaking slightly. "Is someone there?" The laughter came again, followed by the sound of small, running footsteps. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the elevator. The doors slid shut behind me, leaving me alone in the eerie silence. The hallway. The 5th floor looked like a time capsule. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and old murals of colorful animals and balloons faded into obscurity. Child-sized wheelchairs and rusted equipment lined the walls, covered in layers of dust. As I walked, my flashlight beam wavered, catching glimpses of old toys scattered across the floor. A small ball rolled across the hallway ahead of me, stopping at my feet. I froze. The laughter returned, louder now, followed by a whisper. "Play with us." "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the empty corridor. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I saw movement. A small figure darting into one of the rooms. Room 503. I hesitated outside the door of room 503, where the figure had disappeared. The nameplate beside the door was charred, but I could just make out the word pediatric etched beneath the soot. Slowly, I pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through a broken window. Inside, the remnants of the past were everywhere. Tiny beds with faded sheets, a row of stuffed animals sitting on a shelf, and in the corner, an old rocking horse that swayed gently as if touched by an unseen hand. "Is someone in here?" I called out. A soft giggle answered me, coming from behind one of the beds. My heart raced as I stepped closer, flashlight trembling in my hand. "Come out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're not supposed to be here." The giggle turned into a whisper. "We're always here." Suddenly, the rocking horse stopped mid-swing and the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, banging on the door. "Hey, let me out," the whisper grew louder. "Don't leave us. Stay and play." The encounter. I turned back to the room, my flashlight darting across the walls. The shadows seemed to move, creeping closer. My beam landed on a small figure sitting on one of the beds. A little girl, her face pale and hollow, her hair hanging limply over her shoulders. "Who are you?" I stammered, stepping back. She tilted her head, her dark eyes staring straight into mine. "You forgot us," she whispered. "What do you mean? I don't know what you're talking about." "You let us burn," she said, her voice rising. "You didn't save us." "I wasn't here," I said, my back against the door. "I didn't." The girl stood, her hospital gown scorched and tattered. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in visible puffs. She pointed toward the corner of the room, where several other shadowy figures began to materialize. Small children, their faces marked with soot and tears. "You forgot us," they chanted, their voices overlapping. "You left us to burn." The escape panic overtook me. I grabbed the door handle, twisting and pulling with all my strength. "Please, let me go," I shouted. The whispers turned into screams, and the rocking horse began to move violently. The children stepped closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The door flew open suddenly, and I stumbled into the hallway. I didn't stop to look back. I ran toward the elevator, slamming the down button repeatedly. The doors opened just as the laughter returned, echoing from behind me. As the elevator descended, I caught a glimpse of the hallway just before the doors closed. The children stood there, their faces emotionless, watching me. The little girl raised a hand and waved slowly. The aftermath. When I reached the ground floor, I was shaking. "Lisa," the receptionist looked up from her desk, her face concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked. The 5th floor. Someone's up there," I stammered. Her expression darkened. "That's impossible. The 5th floor has been sealed off for years." I stared at her, my chest heaving. "No, I was just there. I saw them. The children." Lisa leaned closer, her voice low. "You shouldn't have gone up there. They never left after the fire." As I left the hospital that night, I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching me. When I glanced back at the building, a single light was on in a window on the 5th floor. And there, silhouetted against the glow, was the little girl, staring down at me. The screen fades to black, leaving viewers with the faint sound of children's laughter and the creaking of a rocking horse. Before getting into today's stories, let me know where everyone is from and what time so we can send wishes of health and luck to you and your relatives and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos of our channel. Thank you very much, everyone. Let's get started. I've been a nurse for nearly 8 years. Nights are usually quiet, though not always easy. The hospital I work at is a modern facility, far from the haunted image of old. Crumbling buildings. Yet every staff member had heard of Room 313, a room where monitors often acted strangely, lights flickered for no reason, and patients reported unseen visitors. I never believed the stories, at least not until that stormy night. It was a Friday and the rain pounded against the windows with relentless fury. Lightning streaked across the sky, briefly lighting the sterile white corridors. I was stationed near the emergency ward but had to check room 313. The patient, Mr. Thompson, was admitted earlier that evening after a mild stroke. Lisa, another nurse, radioed me just past 2 a.m. "Jenny," her voice crackled, unusually tense. "Can you check 313? The vitals monitor keeps dropping signal." "Again," I groaned. "Room 313 always seemed to have these issues." "Maybe the equipment just needs replacing." Lisa paused, her voice quieter. "Maybe, just to check it out, okay?" Her hesitation gave me pause. Lisa wasn't the superstitious type, but tonight something in her tone felt off. I grabbed my clipboard and headed down the dimly lit hallway. The closer I got, the colder the air became, almost as if I'd stepped into an air-conditioned room with the vent blasting. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, flickering sporadically. When I reached room 313, I paused. The door was ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it during my earlier rounds. "Mr. Thompson," I called as I pushed the door open wider. The room was dim, illuminated only by the soft green glow of the monitors and the occasional flash of lightning through the window. Mr. Thompson lay in bed, motionless, his chest rising and falling slowly. "Mr. Thompson," I said again, stepping closer. "How are you feeling? Are you comfortable?" He didn't respond. I reached for his wrist to check his pulse when his hand shot up and grabbed mine. I jumped, nearly dropping my clipboard. His grip was cold, bony, and unnaturally strong. "She's here," he whispered, his voice hoarse. His eyes flickered open, glazed and unfocused, staring somewhere past me. "Don't let her in." I froze. "Who's here, Mr. Thompson?" I asked, my voice trembling. "She watches," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the room. "She stands in the shadows." I turned, aiming my flashlight at the corner. There was nothing but the coat rack draped with a hospital gown. "It's just the shadows, Mr. Thompson," I said, trying to sound calm. "You're probably dreaming." "No," he hissed, his voice rising in panic. "She's real. I saw her. She doesn't leave." I tried to soothe him, gently placing his hand back on the bed. "You're safe here. Try to rest. I'll check your vitals and stay for a moment. Okay?" The lights overhead flickered violently, and the air grew colder. I glanced toward the corner again. Was the coat rack closer? I shook off the thought and adjusted the monitor, which had inexplicably shut off. "Jenny," Mr. Thompson whispered urgently, "don't turn off the lights." The monitor beeped back to life, and I jotted down his vitals. "Don't worry, Mr. Thompson, I won't." "She only comes in the dark," he muttered, clutching the blanket with trembling hands. A sudden crack of thunder made me jump, and the room was plunged into darkness. The power had gone out, leaving only the faint lightning from the window to cast eerie shadows across the walls. "Jenny," Mr. Thompson's voice was barely audible now. "She's here." I turned toward the corner again, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The coat rack was gone. My heart raced, and I stepped back instinctively. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. A soft whisper echoed through the room, faint but chilling. "Help me." "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning back to Mr. Thompson. But he wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were wide with terror, staring directly behind me. "Don't turn around," he breathed. My body froze. I could feel it, something standing just inches away, the air around me growing heavier. A cold breeze brushed the back of my neck, sending chills down my spine. "Leave us alone," Mr. Thompson shouted suddenly, his voice cracking. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Help me." The crash, the coat rack toppled to the floor with a loud crash, and the door slammed shut behind me. I ran to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Jenny!" Lisa's voice crackled through my radio, but it was distorted, faint. "Are you 313? Hear me?" "Lisa!" I shouted into the radio. The door. "Something's wrong." A blood-curdling scream cut me off. I turned back to Mr. Thompson, but he was convulsing violently, his hands clawing at the air. The monitor flatlined, and I rushed to his side, desperately trying to stabilize him. "Stay with me, Mr. Thompson," I pleaded, but his body went limp. The whisper returned, louder, angrier. "Help me!" Suddenly, the lightning illuminated the room, and I saw her, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the corner where the coat rack had been. her head tilted unnaturally, her long dark hair obscuring her face. "Who are you?" I screamed. The lights flickered, and she was gone. The aftermath, the power returned moments later, and the door creaked open. Lisa rushed in, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes darting around the room. I couldn't speak. My hands were trembling as I pointed to Mr. Thompson's body. He was fine. And then, Lisa stepped closer, glancing at the monitors, but the screen was blank. The data had been wiped. The next morning, I went to check the patient logs, but there was no record of Mr. Thompson. Room 313 was listed as unoccupied. Years later, I still avoid room 313. Sometimes when I pass that hallway, I hear faint whispers. "Help me," they plead, echoing softly in the dark. I never look back. The story fades to black, leaving viewers with the haunting sound of a heartbeat monitor and a whisper, "Don't let her in." Working the night shift at Eldermill Nursing Home was usually uneventful. The elderly residents mostly slept through the night, and the quiet halls, though eerie, had become familiar to me over time. I found comfort in the routine, the occasional call bell, adjusting blankets, or offering a glass of water. But one cold November night broke that routine in a way I'll never forget. It was close to midnight, and I was making my rounds. The home was silent except for the faint hum of the heating system and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clocks. I had just finished checking on Mrs. Harper in room 208 when I noticed the light in room 212 flickering. That was odd. The room was empty, as no one had been assigned to it for weeks due to ongoing maintenance. I paused outside the door. The light flickered again, casting strange shadows that danced across the hallway floor. A chill ran through me, but I told myself it was just the old wiring acting up. Eldermill had been built decades ago, and strange quirks like this were nothing new. I reached out to push the door open, but my hand froze halfway. From inside the room came a faint sound, a soft, muffled sobbing. I took a step back, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Tom, the night security guard, was supposed to be doing his rounds nearby. I grabbed my radio and called for him. "Tom, are you near room 212? The light's flickering, and I think I heard something inside." His voice came back, calm but laced with curiosity. "I'm by the break room." "What did you hear?" I hesitated before answering. Sobbing, it sounded like someone crying. Static filled the line for a moment before Tom replied, "Stay there, I'll meet you." While I waited, the sound from the room grew louder. The sobs turned to low murmurs, like someone whispering under their breath. My heart pounded as I strained to catch the words, but they were too faint to make out. I stared at the door, every instinct telling me to walk away, but I couldn't move. Tom arrived a minute later, his flashlight in hand. He gave me a questioning look. "What's going on?" I gestured toward the door. "It's coming from inside. Listen." We both stood in silence, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then, just as Tom was about to speak, the whispering started again. His expression hardened. "You weren't imagining that." He turned the doorknob slowly and pushed the door open. The light overhead flickered violently before going out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Tom's flashlight cut through the shadows, revealing an empty bed, a small nightstand, and a chair in the corner. "There's no one here," he said, stepping inside. His voice echoed slightly in the stillness. I stayed by the doorway, my eyes scanning the room. The air felt heavy, colder than the rest of the building. Tom moved toward the chair, his flashlight illuminating the worn upholstery. As he reached out to inspect it, the door behind me slammed shut, making us both jump. I grabbed the handle and tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. Tom's voice was steady but tense. "It's just the wind. These old buildings." I wasn't convinced. There were no windows open, no draft strong enough to do that. The whispers started again, louder this time, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned toward the sound, my breath hitching as I saw something move. A faint, shadowy figure barely visible in the dim light. "Tom, do you see that?" He swung his flashlight toward the corner, but there was nothing there. "What are you talking about?" "There was someone. I saw—" My voice trailed off as the figure reappeared, this time closer to the bed. It was clearer now, the outline of a person, their features blurred but unmistakably human. The whispers grew more distinct, overlapping and urgent. "Why did you leave me? Why didn't you help?" Tom's flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker. "We need to get out of here," he said, moving toward the door. He pulled at the handle, but it refused to give. His calm facade was starting to crack. This isn't funny. The figure moved again, now standing at the foot of the bed. It was clearer than before. A woman in a hospital gown, her eyes hollow, her mouth moving as though she was speaking, though no sound came out. "Tom," I whispered, barely able to form the words. "She's right there." He turned, his face pale as he finally saw her. For a moment, neither of us moved. The woman's lips stopped moving, and her head tilted slowly, almost curiously. The light above us flickered back on, illuminating the room for a split second. In that brief flash, the woman's expression twisted into one of anguish. The whispers turned into a scream, deafening and filled with pain. Then the room fell silent. The door flew open, and we stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The light in room 212 returned to normal, steady and unassuming. We looked at each other, unsure of what to say. Tom broke the silence. "I don't know what that was, but I'm not going back in there." We reported the incident to the day staff the next morning, but they dismissed it as a trick of the mind caused by exhaustion. Neither of us believed that explanation. Later, I learned that room 212 had been the site of a tragedy years ago. A resident had passed away after being accidentally forgotten during an emergency evacuation. I never worked another night shift at Eldermill, but sometimes when I pass by the building, I feel the same cold air and hear the faint echo of whispers. Why didn't you help me? Back in 2007, I was working part-time as an aide at a hospital in downtown Chicago. The hospital, a mix of old and modern wings, was always bustling with activity. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, accompanied by the distant hum of machines and occasional muffled cries from patients. One morning during my rounds, my supervisor flagged me down. "We've got a new patient in 403, she said. "Elderly lady named Martha. She's frail, so check on her often. She might need extra care." I nodded and made my way to her room. When I walked in, Martha was sitting up in bed, her frail frame propped against a stack of pillows. Her pale hands were clasped tightly, and her eyes were fixed on the window. "Good morning, Martha," I greeted, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm here to help you with anything you need today." She turned to look at me, her face lighting up slightly. "Oh, you're new. Have you seen my daughter?" Her question caught me off guard. "Your daughter?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Clara. She's such a sweet girl. Long brown hair, always wearing her favorite blue dress. She said she'd visit me today." I hesitated. I hadn't seen any visitors that morning. "I'll keep an eye out for her," I said cautiously, trying not to shatter her hope. For the next few days, every time I entered Martha's room, she would bring up Clara. "She was just here," Martha would insist, pointing toward the chair by the window. She sat there smiling at me. Each time, I glanced at the empty chair, unsure of what to say. One evening, as I was fluffing her pillows, Martha suddenly grabbed my wrist. Her grip, despite her frailty, was surprisingly strong. "She told me something last night," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did she say?" I asked, my throat tightening. "She said it's almost time," Martha replied, her eyes locking onto mine. "Time for what?" I managed to ask, my voice shaking slightly. Martha didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned closer, her lips trembling. "She said she's waiting for me. I don't know what she means, but she seemed happy." Later that week, during a particularly quiet night shift, I was passing by room 403 when I heard Martha's voice. "Clara, my darling, you're here." My heart skipped a beat. The door was ajar, and I peeked inside. Martha was sitting up, her arms outstretched toward the empty chair. "Martha?" I called softly, stepping into the room. She turned to me, her face a mixture of joy and frustration. "You scared her away," she said accusingly. "Scared who away?" "Clara," she snapped, her voice trembling. "She was here, sitting right there. Why did you have to interrupt?" I stared at the chair. It was empty. "Martha, there's no one here," I said gently, though my own voice quivered. "You think I'm imagining it?" "Don't you?" she asked, her tone suddenly sharp. "You think I'm just some crazy old woman?" "No, She was here," Martha interrupted, her eyes narrowing. "She told me she'd come back. She said I'd see her again, even if no one else could." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. When Martha's health took a turn for the worse, she was transferred to the ICU. A few days later, she passed away. Her death weighed heavily on me, but life at the hospital moved on. 1 month later, during another late shift, I was mopping the hallway near room 403. The floor was quiet, the kind of silence that made every small noise echo unnervingly. As I approached the room, I felt a sudden chill. The air grew heavy, and the lights flickered faintly. That's when I saw her. At the far end of the hallway stood a young girl, no older than 10. She had long brown hair and wore a simple blue dress. Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice breaking. "Are you lost?" The girl didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked into room 403. My heart raced as I followed her, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I entered the room, it was empty. The bed was neatly made, the chair by the window untouched. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. Later that night, I reviewed the security footage. It showed me walking down the hallway, looking toward room 403. But there was no girl. Just me, staring into an empty corridor. To this day, I still hear Martha's voice in my head, whispering, "She said it's almost time." And every time I pass by room 403, I feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me. Was it Clara finally coming back for her mother? Or was it something else entirely? I had always preferred working the night shift as a cleaner. The silence, the emptiness, the solitude, it all gave me a sense of calm. Elmwood Office Tower, a sleek 20-story building downtown, was my latest assignment. I was responsible for the top 5 floors, the ones used by a law firm. They were always spotless, filled with polished furniture, large windows, and endless rows of files. It was mundane work until one night turned it into something I would never forget. It was a Tuesday night, and I arrived at my usual time, 11 p.m. The building was deserted, as always. I took the elevator to the 16th floor and began my routine. Vacuuming, wiping down desks, emptying trash bins, nothing out of the ordinary. By midnight, I had finished the 16th floor and moved to the 17th. As I pushed my cart into the hallway, I noticed a faint light coming from one of the conference rooms. I frowned. All lights were supposed to be turned off before the staff left for the day. I walked over to the room and peeked inside. The light came from a desk lamp, illuminating an open laptop. Papers were scattered across the table. Stepping inside cautiously, I called out, "If anyone is here, the office is closed." There was no response. The laptop screen displayed a document, a legal brief filled with dense text I did not understand. At the bottom in bold letters it read, "You are not alone." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Shaking my head, I closed the laptop and switched off the lamp. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound, like footsteps behind me. I stopped and turned around, but the room was empty. By 2 a.m., I was on the 19th floor. This floor always felt colder than the others, and the windows rattled faintly even when there was no wind. I was in the break room cleaning the counter when I heard the door creak behind me. Turning quickly, I saw no one there. Still, the air felt heavier. I decided to head back into the hallway, but as I reached the door, I froze. Written on the whiteboard near the exit were 3 words: "Do not stay." My heart pounded. I looked around trying to calm myself. I muttered under my breath, "Someone is playing a prank. Probably someone forgot their files and came back late." Then came the voice. Faint, almost a whisper from the corner of the room. "You are not welcome." I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who is there? Speak up." Silence filled the room, but as I stood there, I could hear faint, labored breathing, slow and deliberate. It seemed to come from just behind me. I turned and rushed into the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. The air felt colder with every step. I knew I should leave, but my curiosity kept pulling me forward. The 20th floor was the last one on my list. If I could finish quickly, I could put the night behind me. The 20th floor was darker than the others. The fog outside made the large windows look like mirrors, reflecting the dim light inside. I was halfway through cleaning one of the corner offices when I heard the whisper again. "Leave." This time the voice was clearer, sharper. I froze, clutching my flashlight tightly. Slowly I turned toward the sound. Standing in the doorway was a figure. It was a woman, her outline faint and blurry, as though she was fading in and out of existence. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. "What do you want? Why are you here?" She stepped forward, her features becoming clearer. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken and full of sorrow. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she raised her hand and pointed toward the large desk at the end of the room. I hesitated, but something compelled me to move closer. On the desk was a photo frame. It showed a young woman standing in front of the Elmwood office tower smiling. Beside her was a man in a suit, his hand resting on her shoulder. The date at the bottom of the photo was from 1982. As I stared at the photo, the woman's voice broke the silence. "You need to leave." I turned to face her, my heart racing. "What happened here? Why are you still here?" She did not answer. Instead, her expression darkened. "They lied," she said. "They betrayed me." "Who betrayed you? What did they do to you?" She moved closer, her movements slow and deliberate. Her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "They took everything. And now, they take more." The lights flickered violently and the air grew icy. The room felt like it was closing in around me. I stepped back, my breath visible in the cold. "I will leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I will not take anything." Her gaze softened slightly, but she did not move. The lights flickered again, and she was gone. I grabbed my cleaning cart and bolted for the elevator. As the doors closed, I heard her voice one last time, faint and echoing. "Do not come back." The next day, I told my supervisor about what had happened. He looked at me, his face serious. "You saw Margaret, didn't you?" "Margaret?" I asked, confused. He nodded. "Margaret Thompson. She used to be one of the partners here. Back in the 80s, she was found dead on the 20th floor. They said it was an accident, but no one really believed that." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head. People who worked here back then said the floor was never the same after that. Most of us avoided at night. I transferred to another building the following week. But sometimes when I drive past Elmwood office tower late at night, I see a faint light glowing in one of the windows on the 20th floor. And I wonder if Margaret is still there, waiting for someone to listen or for someone else to stay. I never imagined my side gig as a nighttime security guard at Glenview High School would be anything more than a paycheck. The hours were dull, the school empty except for the occasional maintenance worker or stray cat wandering into the gym. But the silence was calming, and I enjoyed having time to myself. The job was simple. Patrol the halls every hour, check the locks on the doors, and ensure the alarms were set. That was it. Nothing ever happened. At least that's what I thought until one particular night. It was late October, and the air outside was crisp, the kind that made you pull your jacket tighter around you. The shift started like any other. I grabbed my flashlight and began my rounds. The school, with its long corridors and old lockers, was eerily quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps echoing on the tile floors and the occasional creak of the old building settling. I was midway through my first patrol when my radio crackled to life. "Hey, Kyle," came the voice of Mark, the maintenance guy. "You doing rounds near the science wing?" "Not yet," I replied, pausing near the cafeteria. "Why?" There was a pause. Thought I saw a light on in one of the classrooms. Could just be the motion sensor acting up, but it looked weird. I sighed. "I'll check it out." The science wing was my least favorite part of the school. The lights there always seemed dimmer, and the old lab equipment gave the rooms a strange chemical smell. As I walked down the hallway, my flashlight beam danced over the faded posters of periodic tables and motivational quotes on the walls. When I reached the room Mark mentioned, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and light spilled out into the hallway. "Mark, you sure no one's working late?" I asked into my radio. "Positive," he replied. "I'm in the boiler room and everyone else clocked out hours ago." "Great," I muttered. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside. The room was empty, the desks neatly arranged, but the overhead projector was on, casting a faint flickering light onto the whiteboard. The words "Do not forget" were scrawled across it in shaky handwriting. My stomach tightened. "Mark, did you set up any equipment in here tonight?" "No," he said. "Why?" "There's a projector running," I replied, my voice lower now, "and someone left a message." Mark's voice crackled back, sounding uneasy. "What kind of message?" "Just some writing," I said. "Probably a prank. I'll turn it off." I reached for the projector's power button, but before I could press it, the words on the board began to change. Slowly, one letter at a time, they spelled out, "You're not alone." I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor. My heart raced as I spun around, scanning the room. It was empty, completely still. "Kyle, what's going on?" Mark's voice cut through the radio. The board, I started but stopped myself. What could I say? That it was typing on its own? I'm coming to you, Mark said. Hang tight. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. Forcing myself to stay calm, I picked up my flashlight and backed toward the door. As I reached it, a loud thud echoed from the supply closet in the corner of the room. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. The closet door creaked open, inch by inch. My flashlight beam shook as I aimed it at the dark space inside. There was nothing, just shelves of lab supplies and an old mop leaning against the wall. Who's there? I demanded, taking a step closer. A voice, faint and broken, whispered from the shadows. Don't leave me. Mark arrived a few minutes later, finding me standing frozen outside the room. Are you okay? He asked, eyeing me warily. I shook my head. There's something in there. The board, the closet, something's not right. Mark frowned but stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. See? Nothing here, he said, gesturing to the room. The projector, I said, it was on. It wrote something. Mark pointed to the whiteboard. It was blank now, as if nothing had ever been written there. Kyle, I think you're just tired. I wanted to argue, but the look on his face stopped me. Instead, I followed him out of the room, hoping the rest of the night would pass without incident. But it didn't. Around 3 a.m., I was sitting in the security office, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was just my imagination. The monitor showing the school's security cameras was quiet, each feed displaying empty hallways and classrooms. Then on the feed for the science wing, I saw it. A shadow moved across the camera, tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stopped in front of room 202, the room with the projector, and then it turned toward the camera. Kyle, come in! Mark's voice crackled over the radio. I'm in the gym. Something's wrong with the lights. They're flickering like crazy. I stared at the screen, unable to look away from the shadowy figure. Its head tilted, as if it could see me through the camera. Then, with a sudden burst of static, the monitor went dark. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted from the office, heading toward the gym. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly in the dim light. When I reached the gym, I found Mark standing in the middle of the court, looking up at the flickering lights. There's something in the science wing, I said breathlessly. Mark turned to me, his face pale. Kyle, there's something here too. Before I could ask what he meant, the gym doors slammed shut behind us. The lights overhead flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the walls. And then we heard it, a low, guttural voice echoing through the gym. Why did you leave me? Mark and I spun around, our flashlights darting across the room. The shadows seemed to move on their own, crawling across the floor and walls like living things. In the corner, a figure began to take shape. It was the same one I'd seen on the camera. Tall, thin, and impossibly dark. Run, Mark whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted for the doors, throwing them open and sprinting into the hallway. The voice followed us, growing louder with each step. You left me here. Don't leave me again. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cool night air hitting our faces. Mark locked the doors behind us, his hands shaking. What the hell was that? I asked, gasping for breath. Mark didn't answer. He just stared at the building, his eyes wide with fear. In one of the windows, a faint light flickered, a shadow passing across it before disappearing entirely. The next morning, we both quit. I never went back to Glenview High, but sometimes when I drive past it late at night, I see the flickering light in the science wing, and I swear I hear a whisper. Don't leave me. I never minded working night shifts at Parkview Hospital. The quiet halls, the soft glow of emergency lights, and the gentle hum of machines created a calm atmosphere that made the hours pass quickly. My colleagues always shared stories about strange occurrences, but I brushed them off as exaggerations. That was until one night changed everything. It was a typical night. The hospital was quiet, the patients were resting, and I was finishing up my rounds. Around 2 a.m., I decided to check on a patient in room 408, a quiet corner of the hospital often left empty. Tonight, however, the room was occupied by Mr. Carter, an elderly man recovering from a minor surgery. As I approached the door, I felt a chill in the air. The temperature seemed to drop the closer I got. I shook off the unease and knocked gently before entering. Mr. Carter was awake, Sitting up in bed, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "How are you feeling tonight?" He did not respond. His hands gripped the blanket tightly and his breathing was shallow. I stepped closer, noticing how pale he looked. "Mr. Carter, is everything all right?" Without looking at me, he whispered, "She is here." I frowned. "Who is here, Mr. Carter?" "There is no one else in the room." He finally turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "She stands there in the corner, watching, waiting." I followed his gaze to the corner of the room, but it was empty. I tried to reassure him. "Sometimes after surgery, patients can experience hallucinations. It is just the medication, Mr. Carter. You are safe here." But he shook his head, his voice trembling. "She was here last night too. She does not like it when people stay." I tried to keep my voice calm. "What did she do last night, Mr. Carter?" He hesitated, his breathing quickening. "She just stood there, but then she moved closer. I could hear her whispering. She said I was not supposed to be here." "What did she whisper?" His voice dropped to a barely audible murmur. "Leave, or you will stay forever." I checked his vitals, which were surprisingly stable, despite his clear distress. After a few moments, he seemed to calm down, though his eyes never left that corner of the room. I told him to call me if he needed anything and left the room, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Back at the nurse's station, I reviewed his chart, hoping to find something that could explain his behavior. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Just as I was beginning to relax, the call button from room 408 lit up. I rushed back, my pulse quickening. Mr. Carter was sitting upright again, sweat beading on his forehead. "She is closer now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She said she wants you to leave." My skin prickled. "Mr. Carter, there is no one here but us. I will stay with you for a while, all right?" He nodded reluctantly, still staring at the corner. I pulled up a chair and sat beside his bed. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the machines. After a few minutes, he seemed to relax, his breathing evening out. "Do you think she is still there?" he asked suddenly, his voice trembling. I glanced toward the corner, trying to keep my expression neutral. "I do not see anything, but I will check if that makes you feel better." "Please," he whispered, "but do not get too close." I stood, my flashlight in hand, and approached the corner of the room. Nothing seemed unusual, but the air felt colder. I turned back to him. "There is nothing here, Mr. Carter. You are safe." Before I could sit down again, the lights flickered. It was brief, but enough to make my heart race. Mr. Carter's grip on my arm tightened. "She is angry," he muttered. "Why would she be angry?" He looked at me, his eyes glistening with tears. "She thinks you are trying to take me away. She does not want me to leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. The lights flickered again, staying off for a second longer this time. In the dim emergency light, I thought I saw a shadow move. My breath caught in my throat. "Mr. Carter's voice broke the silence. She is behind you." I spun around, shining the flashlight into the corner. It was empty, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. My hand trembled as I turned back to him. His face was pale, his eyes filled with terror. "I need to leave this room," he said suddenly. "Please, take me anywhere else." I hesitated. The room was no different from any other in the hospital. Yet his fear was palpable. "All right, Mr. Carter, let me find another room for you." As I stepped out into the hall, I felt a cold draft. The corridor was empty, but the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest. I hurried back to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I found a new room for Mr. Carter and returned to help him move. As we exited room 408, he seemed to relax, though he clutched my arm tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "She cannot follow me now." I glanced back at the empty room, the door still ajar. The corner he had been so fixated on was shrouded in shadow, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement. A figure, faint and still, watching. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I avoided going near room 408. The next morning, I told the day shift nurse about what had happened. She gave me a strange look. "Room 408 used to be part of the old wing," she said. "Before the renovations, there were stories about a nurse who worked there. She was accused of mistreating patients and disappeared after being fired. Some say her spirit still lingers, angry and restless." I tried to dismiss the story, but I could not forget the fear in Mr. Carter's eyes. Even now, when I pass by room 408, I feel a chill in the air. And sometimes, just before the lights flicker, I think I hear faint footsteps behind me. 40. I moved into a small, affordable apartment on the outskirts of the city a few months ago. It wasn't much. A single bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and creaky floors, but it was enough for me. The building was old with faded wallpaper and an elevator that groaned every time it moved. My neighbors were mostly quiet, and I liked it that way. Or at least I thought I did. One night I came home late from work. The hallway was dimly lit as usual, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. As I passed by apartment 3C, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I paused, glancing inside. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of a television playing static. It felt off, but I kept walking, telling myself it was none of my business. When I got back to my apartment, I locked the door and started making a late dinner. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables and the warmth of the stove helped me forget the eerie scene. But as I was washing up, I heard it. A faint knock. It was soft, almost hesitant. I froze, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. I opened my front door and looked down the hallway. It was empty. Just as I was about to close it, I heard a voice, faint and childlike. "Stay, don't leave me." I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. For the rest of the night, I sat on the couch, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. The next morning, I saw Mr. O'Leary, my neighbor from 3B, in the hallway. He was an older man, always polite but reserved. I decided to ask him if he'd noticed anything strange. "Hey, have you ever heard or seen anything odd around here?" Mr. O'Leary stopped, his eyes narrowing. "You mean the knocking?" I nodded. "Surprised," he sighed, lowering his voice. "Let me guess. 3C, I nodded again. A chill running through me. He shook his head. "You're new, so you probably don't know. No one's lived in 3C for years." His words hung in the air as he shuffled off down the hall. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. If no one lived in 3C, who had left the door open? And what about the static on the TV? Later that evening, I returned from the grocery store and found myself staring at the door to 3C. It was closed now, but the memory of the night before lingered. I was about to head to my apartment when I heard footsteps behind me. "You shouldn't stand here too long," Mr. O'Leary said, his voice almost a whisper. "Why?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated before answering. "Years ago, a woman and her daughter lived there. Quiet folks, kept to themselves. One night, the woman, his voice trailed off. The police said it was an accident, but..." He stopped, glancing at the door as if expecting it to open. "But what happened?" I pressed. He shook his head. "Let's just say the little girl didn't make it. Ever since, strange things have been happening in that apartment. People hear voices, see things. No one stays there for long. I tried to laugh it off as an urban legend, but that night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A faint knock, this time coming from the wall next to my bed. My bedroom shared a wall with 3C. I sat up, holding my breath. The knock came again, followed by a faint whisper. "Why did you leave me?" The voice was clear, almost pleading. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear to the wall. There was a pause, then another whisper. "Come back." The next day, I went to the building manager. I wanted answers. Mr. Raines, a gruff man in his 60s, looked annoyed when I asked about 3C. "It's just a room," he said. "Old building. Bad wiring. People imagine things." "But why doesn't anyone live there?" I asked. He avoided my gaze. "Renovations. That's all." I wasn't satisfied with his answers. That evening, armed with a flashlight, I stood outside the door to 3C. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, cold room. The air smelled faintly of mildew, and dust covered every surface. As I stepped inside, I noticed something strange. A child's drawing was pinned to the wall. It showed two figures, one small, one taller, holding hands. Beneath it, written in shaky letters, were the words, "Stay with me." I felt a chill run down my spine. The door suddenly slammed shut behind me. My flashlight flickered, and the whisper started again. "Why did you leave me?" I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. It was faint, almost human-shaped. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and desperate. "Stay, don't go, come back." I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the knob, but it wouldn't turn. The shadow grew clearer. A little girl, her face pale and her eyes wide. She reached out a hand toward me, her lips moving soundlessly. I froze, unable to look away. Her expression wasn't angry or threatening. It was sad, almost pleading. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The whispers became a scream, deafening and filled with anguish. Then just as suddenly, everything went silent. The shadow disappeared and the door flew open. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I moved out of the building the next day, but sometimes in the quiet of the night, I still hear it, a faint knock, followed by the soft voice of a little girl. Stay with me. It was a quiet Tuesday night in 2010 when I was working my usual shift as a security officer at a suburban hospital. My job was straightforward, patrolling the halls, ensuring the safety of staff and patients, and occasionally handling tasks no one else wanted to do. Around 11 p.m., I got a call from the ICU. A patient had passed, and I was needed to transport the body to the morgue. This wasn't unusual, but it never got easier. Death has a way of leaving a cold, heavy feeling in the air, and I could already sense it as I stepped into the room. The nurse on duty greeted me with a sympathetic nod and gestured toward the bed. He passed about an hour ago. They just signed off. The man was in his mid-60s, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. What happened? I asked, pulling on a pair of gloves. Heart failure, she replied quietly. He came in alone, no family. I paused for a moment. That felt heavier than usual. No family, no visitors, just silence. Let's get this done, I said, wheeling the gurney into place. As I zipped the body bag, I noticed something unusual. The man's face seemed off. His features were frozen in a grimace, his eyes just barely open. Did he look like this when you found him? I asked the nurse, my voice low. She glanced at the body, her brow furrowing. No, I don't think so. He was calm when I checked. We exchanged a look but didn't say more. I pushed the gurney out into the hallway and made my way toward the elevator. The morgue was always unsettling. Dim lighting, the hum of the ventilation, and the sterile, icy air gave it an atmosphere that pressed on your chest. As I transferred the body into one of the freezer compartments, I heard the nurse's voice echo in my head. No family. I closed the freezer door and stood there for a moment longer than necessary. The silence seemed louder in that room, the air heavier. I shook it off and turned to leave. But just as I reached the door, I heard a faint sound, a shuffle. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to make me freeze. Hello, I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. No response. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing, just the empty trays and the sealed freezer compartments. I swallowed hard and walked out, convincing myself it was just the sound of the ventilation system. The next morning, the funeral home staff arrived. I escorted them down to the morgue, feeling a bit more at ease in the daylight. Here he is, I said, unlocking the freezer compartment and sliding out the tray. One of the men frowned. Wait a second. This isn't right. What do you mean? I asked, stepping closer. The man pointed at the body bag. The zipper was slightly undone, and the man's arm was draped awkwardly across his chest. I stared, my mind racing. That's not how I left him. The funeral director looked at me suspiciously. You're telling me no one else has been down here? No one. I'm the only one with the key, I insisted. He gestured for his colleague to unzip the bag fully. As the zipper came down, the room fell into an eerie silence. The man's face was twisted in an expression of terror, his mouth wide open, his eyes bulging. What the hell happened here? The director demanded, his voice trembling with anger. I don't know, I stammered. The other man stepped back, shaking his head. I've never seen anything like this. I swear I didn't touch him, I said, my voice growing desperate. The funeral director leaned closer to the body, his face pale. His lips moved as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally, he straightened up. We'll take it from here, he muttered. Let's just get out of this place. That night, I couldn't shake the image of the man's face. I kept seeing it every time I closed my eyes. By the time my shift started, I felt a growing sense of dread as I approached the morgue. I told myself it was just my imagination, but as I entered the cold room, the air felt different, thicker, colder, almost suffocating. I stood by the freezer, staring at the closed compartment. Then I heard it again, the shuffle, louder this time, followed by a faint whisper. Let me out. My breath caught in my throat. Who's there? I said, my voice cracking. The room fell silent, but then the whisper came again, more insistent this time. Let me out. My hands trembled as I reached for the freezer handle. Slowly I opened it, revealing the empty tray. The body was gone. The lights flickered and I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty. Let me out. The voice was right next to me now, but there was no one there. I bolted out of the morgue, slamming the door behind me. To this day, I can still hear that voice echoing in my mind. And no matter how many times I tell myself it was all in my head, I'll never set foot in that morgue again.